This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air. Mānawatia, Matariki. You're listening to the OI podcast.
Kia ora, brought to you by the Otago Institute,
the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. I'm Dr. Barb.
And I'm Trudy.
And today we've got a special reflections episode because we're right in the middle of Matariki.
And it's all about reflections.
It's about reflections and reflecting on the past, things that have gone, on the present, where we are now, and looking forward to the future and where things are. And we look back through our library of episodes, and we did notice that the Paerau Warbrick, Dr. Paerau Warbrick from the Otago University came in and did a really interesting discussion ahead of last year's general election, the 2023 election. The interview really didn't focus that much on the election itself. It was all about Māori freehold land, what is Māori freehold land, what's customary land, and the principles of Waitangi and what that means to different people, and sort of reflecting on those ideas. So
would be really valuable. I don't think anything's changed since we had that podcast last year. So
I think if anything,
reflect.
And I think if anything, the topic has got more salient to today's discussion.
Exactly.
And there's a few others. So we'll replay that right now. But while we've got you here and we're listening, we'll just put a plug to go through to our backload. So our podcasts are available.
They're available somewhere.
They're available everywhere. They're available on Spotify. They're available on Apple Podcasts. Basically anywhere where you get your podcasts from.
On Otago Access, on
and
their
Otago
website.
Access. Yeah, just go to the Otago Access Radio website, or indeed to the Otago Institute website, where they're all up there as well. And there's a range. We've just gone through here and picked out. I'm going to let Trudy go through and say all these beautiful, beautiful interviews that we had from our previous series.
So we had Paulette Tamati Lefe. I was going to say Eiffel, it's an Eiffel Tower, but wrong.
So Paulette from Otago, she was talking all about the kaitahu names and the place names all around Otago. And Angela Wanhala talking about Mānawatia.
And we had Lizzie Cole Designs.
Lizzie Cole.
I can't read Barbara's writing here, I have to say.
Lizzie Cole Designs. Yeah, so we had Lizzie and Rudy, and they came on with their amazing neon-coloured, beautiful crochet designs that they've done, and they've done that whare nui all in crochet, which is absolutely fantastic.
And we also had Madison Kelly.
Yeah, beautiful young kaitahu, our age. When you're as old as Trudy and I are, everyone's young kaitahu artists. And yeah, right from here, from Dunedin, come through the Dunedin School of Art. Gorgeous. And we've also there's a gorgeous interview earlier on with Jeanette Wikaiwa, talking about hone tūwhare. Excellent. And have a lovely Matariki.
Yeah, exactly. Enjoy. Great time for it, to reflect, look on the past, think about the future. Amazing.
Share food, share company with your friends and family.
Share stories.
Yeah. Today, I am extremely privileged to be talking with Dr. Paerau Warbrick from the Senior Lecturer at Te Tumu School of Māori Pacific and Indigenous Studies at the Otago University. Paerau has a PhD in Māori Studies and History and an LLB from Otago University. Dr. Paerau is a barrister and has been practicing law for over 20 years in the area of wills, trusts and Māori land. Kia ora, Paerau, and thanks for joining us in the studio today.
Kia ora, Barbara. And thank you for that warm-up.
Feel free to introduce yourself there, a little mihi to the audience and to the podcast listeners at home there.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today, and as Barbara has said, I hold my degrees at the University of Otago, and I've practiced now in the area of wills and trusts and Māori land for the over 20 years, but I'm also a senior lecturer at the University of Otago, and I lecture on the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal, and general Māori society issues, and that from time to time. And I'm extremely privileged to be here today and to share a bit of my knowledge with anyone out there, and hopefully it can demystify various things to do with Māori society and And that's what I'm here to do, just basically talk about certain things, and we'll just go from there and see if I can help out to inform people, all sorts of things like that.
And particularly of interest around the election, because we're right in that election run-up at the moment. And last episode we had Janine Hayward come in, and we just talked briefly about the Māori electoral roll and the general roll and the difference between those two, and also a little bit about the Māori electoral seats. So we might touch on that a bit later in the show.
Yes.
I wanted just to follow on from the introduction there. Is one thing that I think is quite often is confusing to folks who haven't had much connection to Māori land is, what is Māori land? How is that different from just everyday Joe Bloggs owning land, or a company, or any other form of land? What is the special about Māori land there? It doesn't just mean Joe Bloggs who owns a piece of land and happens to have Māori whakapapa, does it?
Well,
or maybe it does.
Well, Māori land is basically this category called Māori freehold land today, and there's only about 5% of it left in New Zealand. And really, it's the remnants of the traditional Māori customary land that's left over, that's still in existence today. Since the 1840s and even before that, there's been a transfer of Māori land into the hands of the settlers and into the government and that. And over time, that's through these huge purchases in the South Island, Waitangi, Auckland areas. And in the 1860s, you had confiscations within the Bay of Plenty and Waikato, Taranaki area. And then we had the Māori Land Court, which turned around and transferred Māori customary title, that was land just held by the Māori people, and turned around and says, rightio, we're going to change all your systems, and you're going to be issued a certificate.
A certificate.
And we're going to call that thing Māori freehold land, and there we go. And over time, the settlers as well as the government has even gone and managed to take as much Māori freehold land as they can, and so really about 5% is left, and it's really the most marginal lands left, because the Crown, the settlers, they didn't really want it, and so a lot of this land is very marginal and small holdings, and the big question is, how do the Māori people deal with it today? And so all those politicians in the Māori electorate seats, they all know about Māori freehold land. Well, most of it is in farming area. There's hardly any within city areas, and I think there's about an acre in Dunedin still, but that was
where would that be?
Oh, that's the Arai Te Uru marae, and that was changed into Māori freehold land in about 1990s, really.
Oh, right.
And but most is all really in the rural areas still.
So when you say marginal land, you're talking about agriculturally marginal?
Oh, yeah.
Like not the high productivity, high producing sort of land?
Oh, no, because the government and the Crown, the government, the Crown and the settlers, they wanted the best of the best. So they took the best, and then they went for the second best. Then they went for the third best. And then when Māori went to go and turn around and improve what lands they had left, they went to go and take that as well.
Right.
So really you have very marginal lands, usually swamp lands, ones in inaccessible areas, which is hard farming. Oh, just for the listeners too, I also came from a farming background.
Ah, right.
As well.
Whereabouts was your farming background?
And that was in the Whakatane area. I was born and raised amongst my people there. Those are the Ngāti people. Ah. And that is my principal iwi there. And so I actually grew up on Māori freehold land. It's our small holdings, and that was the land that was originally given back to us by the Crown when we turned around and said, well, we weren't rebels against the Crown. We were loyal. Every Māori who had their lands confiscated in the Waikato, Taranaki and Bay of Plenty areas, of course, we had to turn around and say, oh, we were very loyal to the Crown just to get our lands back.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's Māori freehold land too.
Right. And who owns Māori freehold land? Is that owned by different iwi, or is it owned by everyone together, or what's the ownership around that, or is it owned by hapu, or?
It's actually owned by the individual whānau.
Oh, right.
So you have children that are listed as owners. You have a whole range of whānau members. So some blocks have about 800, 900 people, whānau members,
right,
as owners. Iwi, absolutely not, because these land holdings were held by whānau,
right,
really, and that. And so the big question is, when you get all of these particular blocks that have these multiple owners, how do you deal?
I was just going to say, it must be really hard to work out what you're going to do and get consensus there.
Well, the thing about it is the government and Māori turned around and created these legal entities to manage these lands.
Right.
And they're things like Māori incorporations, and that's basically putting lands into a type of company structure. That was done in about the 1890s and early 20th century. And
that's quite a long time ago now.
Yeah, and that was through one of our famous Māori politicians, Apiranga Ngata, was involved there.
Right, and did he hold one of these Māori seats? The Māori electoral seats?
Yes, he was the Eastern Māori MP from 1905 to 1943.
Right.
And there was, he supported another Māori MP, James Carroll, who also held the Eastern Māori MP seat, one of these Māori electorate. And they, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they had this problem to turn around and, well, how are we going to deal with these lands? There's so many owners. And they says, well, how about we put them into these company structures? And those are these Māori incorporations which still exist today. Right. And that went along reasonably well in some circumstances, not so much in another, because the major thing with Māori land is basically capital, raising capital to work these lands.
Right, because it's an asset, but it doesn't have a lot of liquid capital. Like
no, and you can't readily sell Māori land, so the banks don't want to touch this stuff. So there's always this issue about capital.
Right, and I guess getting a bank loan for improvements is actually also quite difficult with that many.
Yeah, so the Māori usually have to go to the Crown and say, well, could we have various loans through you over time, and so these Māori corporations, as well as ordinary Māori land blocks, they negotiated with whoever to raise funds. Some banks also allowed loans to be raised, and of course, if you can't make the land work, the bank takes it. So there's the land.
So the land is the collateral for of course.
Yep, absolutely. And then
it's quite a big step in the first place, because there's obviously a long history of the ownership of this Maori land in whānau hands, and then it's sort of as a consequence of the settlers arriving, it's this kind of pushing that into a Western political legal structure of companies in order to kind of make it the best that you can to keep ownership of it, I guess, there. So it's kind of a...
Yeah, well, you see, the company structure, it worked to a certain degree in that. But then in the 1950s and 1960s, they came about under the old Māori Affairs Act. The Māori Land Court started to develop trusts over Māori land, because these company structures are very foreign concepts to Māori. Whereas trust structures, having a trustee, looking after land for people, that's more in line with the
kind
older...
of resonates a bit better with
and we're talking the original trust structures instead of the modern day trust structures where people organise it to...
dodge taxes.
I never said that, but it's in terms of to organise their financial affairs and all that stuff. And so it's what originally trusts were used for was to look after large amounts of Māori land in terms of Māori, to look after assets, to make them work for Māori. And just as a comparison, the original trust structures, even within Pākehā society, were designed for people who couldn't really look after their land. So children that have been orphaned or widows, where basically
they were female, so they were unable to think properly.
Yeah, well, but of course all men controlled these things. And so when the poor husband dies, the wife doesn't know, I don't know anything about these things. And then someone else comes and looks after it. Those were what particular trust structures were designed for. And then, of course, within the 1970s, 1980s, lawyers like myself turned around and says, hey, we could use this for financial advantage.
Right.
And we've gotten ourselves into certain political situations today where the government goes, well, trust structures, okay. But whenever this comes up in terms of looking at how to tax trusts and various things, I always sort of cringe, because the implication is, well, what is going to happen with all these Māori trusts that we've had? Because those are the traditional lands still left. And of course it's assets, right? So it's actually, there's not a lot of liquid capital to pay taxes. Yeah, but also the other thing too with these trusts and lands, they are much more than land, because they are the remnants of the traditional lands left over. There's all that cultural aspect. Right. That Māori are looking towards their traditional lands as these are the last bits of pieces of our original culture left. And so it's like the marae in that these are the last vestiges of what it meant to be traditional Māori. And so even raising loans on it, or even developing it to such a level, it's like, shouldn't we be just looking after this? Shouldn't we turn around and just let the land turn around and go back to swampland? Because I remember as a kid in the 1970s, and that, well, you see, the big thing was a lot of Māori, we had our land still in swampland. And there was a government policy back then to turn around and say, you need to drain your swamps and put it into production and put a lot of fertilizer on it. Yeah. And there's a lot of ecological value in swampland. And all that. And Māori people were turning around and saying, well, no, well, there's the birds there and all that. But government policy was always, that's older ways of thinking. You've got to take your assets and all that stuff. But us Māori, we were talking about, no, because this is part and parcel of the environment. You've got pukeko, you've got ducks, you've got eels, or they're good for the whenua. Yeah, it's for very the much life force of the sort whenua. Of neoliberal type attitude, capitalism, and just kind of extraction of the land for gain, isn't it? And that sort of Western look there, particularly for the 80s and that sort of period in New Zealand. Well, it was before that, after Victorian as well. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, probably. Well, it's really absolutely in the 1800s there, which unfortunately coincided. Well, it's even earlier, actually, with industrialisation in the 1700s, and that was the theme of removing the common people from English lands, all the rich and powerful. That's exactly how my forebears ended up here. Moving into the great cities of Glasgow and Liverpool and all that, because all those rich lords and ladies, they took even the English people's lands. Yeah, and Irish and Welsh and Scottish. So the land, shipping all the crofters out of the Shetlands and Scotland there for sheep farming. Yeah. It's a big thing. Hey, let's just take a step back from that, because it's Maori land. It's very interesting, and we could talk the entire episode just on that. Yes. But going back to thinking, that's actually quite a small portion. It's a very important portion, but it's actually only 5% of the total land. But then taking a step back to the Treaty of Waitangi, and I thought we could just spend a little bit of time just putting the Treaty of Waitangi into context and what that means. Well, that's got to do with land too. The Treaty of Waitangi. Yes. That's well, I teach on the Treaty of Waitangi, you see, and I turn around and I'll discuss it in this podcast. I've always said to students and also to the listeners out there, when you come across this idea, this phrase, Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi, is the Māori version of the treaty. What I want you to turn around and do is to think about it. You really got to think about it in three forms in that. And it's helpful to think of the treaty, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, in three forms, because you've got the actual treaty texts It's a document. It's in the National Library up in Wellington. You can go and have a look at all these copies of the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
It has all the signatures all on it there
And
on
it has
display
all,
as well.
Yep, it has all the signatures. So there's 9 copies of this. There's the original one that was signed at Waitangi, and then various government agents took copies around the country to get Māori to sign. And so the Bunbury copy, they call it, made it down here in the South Island at Otago here in about August 1840. And you had the 3 Ngaitahu Rangatira, Tairoa, Korako, and Karetai sign it off the Otago heads over there. But there's 9 of these copies around. One is in English. That was a copy at the Manukau heads. So you can go and read these particular copies and actually see what was actually part of that Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi deal. Now, most ones in New Zealand will not be able to read Te Tiriti o Waitangi and that. And then you've got various translations there. And you'll be able to read the English copy and that. And you will actually see, if you compare, and I encourage everyone to go on the net, go and search for copies of translations, but you will see that what was supposed to pass over to the various parties were inconsistent. So there's this idea in terms of, was sovereignty given over in the Treaty of Waitangi by Māori to the Crown and that? And, well, you've got the problem there that you've only got one copy that was in English. All the rest in the Māori words was this idea of kāwanatanga, transferring this idea of kāwanatanga over to the British Crown. And then, was kāwanatanga the same as sovereignty? And the answer is no. They're 2 different words, 2 different concepts in that. And there is the major issue in terms of, if we're going to start talking about the texts, and academics left, right and centre will be arguing about what these phrases mean. So you can go and have a look at what the particular problems of these texts are. So that's one way of looking at it. And the major author on the treaty texts was this Paerau woman, Ruth Ross. She did a wonderful article in 1972 comparing the Māori version and the English version, and you can go and have a look in the New Zealand Journal of History. In 1972.
Can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
Just quickly for some clarification in my own mind. When you say the 8 versions in Te Reo Māori, were they all the same?
They were all the same.
So they are word for word all the same. And they're the ones that travelled round that people were signing, right?
Yeah.
So the people in the South Island, for instance, here, they would only have seen that version.
Well, yeah, and of course.
Because the English version was left.
Was over at the Manukau Heads.
At the Manukau Heads. And that wasn't travelling around together. So the people who were signing anywhere but at the Manukau Heads, they would have only read that Māori version. So in essence, they didn't have any idea they may have known that an English translation existed, but they didn't read it, right?
Well, the thing about it is they couldn't read it.
Yeah.
And they were relying on missionaries to explain what it meant. And the types of ideas that were conveyed to Māori was that this is better for you, this governor will be able to protect you.
Right.
And all that stuff, and this ongoing particular relationship. Māori, you can have your lands, everything stays the same. And that's within the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, as well as within the Treaty of Waitangi. The British Crown guaranteed to Māori, in the English version, that lands and estates, forests and fisheries and other properties. And people can go and read that. But then again, I turned around and said, remember, these are the texts. Māori couldn't read them. They relied on these oral guarantees given by missionaries and encouraging them to sign. But of course, not all Māori rangatira, as well as communities, the various hapu, actually signed it.
Right.
and all that. So you've got the likes of, for down here, there's Te Huruhuru, which was a very powerful chief up around the Waimaru Timaru area. Well, Kopi never went to him, as well as all other areas. And all
so
that.
there's a whole an extra issue there of some people did sign and some people didn't. Who actually drafted the treaty itself?
Well, it was a mixture of Governor Hobson as well as James Busby, who was the British representative in New Zealand. They called him a British resident at the time, and they all turned around. That was the English version,
right?
And then the missionary Henry Williams, and he did some translations of the particular English version.
So no one actually writing the original text was actually a first language te reo Māori speaker.
Well, no, but I think that people actually overemphasise that. The particular thing is when you actually look at the treaty text, it's actually good enough for its purpose. And we often forget this. We often think that, well, they should have been lawyers that turned around and drafted these. These people weren't lawyers but this was colonial times. I mean, the only lawyers you had were over in Sydney. And half of them were convicts anyway, and all that. No, I'm being disparaged to our Australian brothers and sisters.
That's true. We shouldn't disparage Australia here. No.
Yeah.
But still, it was a completely different time, and of course, it was a completely different social structure as well.
And that's the reason why also there was that English version.
Yeah.
And that I kind of equate it to the New Zealand way in terms of, are we going to turn around and write up a fresh te reo version for the Manukau heads? One moment we've got an English version here. That's good enough. She'll be right. And they go over there and take that. But as I said, that's just in regard to the treaty texts.
Right. So you had three ways that we're thinking of this.
Yeah.
So the first way is just looking at the text.
I looked at the text, and you can go and have a look and see what was intended, and you can go and read up Mrs. Ruth Ross's 1972 article in the New Zealand Journal of History about text and translations, and that's a wonderful piece that she did there. And that's one way of looking at the treaty. Then, of course, you've got this phrase, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi are not the actual Treaty of Waitangi. What it is that there's this phrase, principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, that was actually placed into the Treaty of Waitangi Act of 1975 that set up the Waitangi Tribunal. And the Waitangi Tribunal in the 1970s was set up to look at all these old Māori land claims, because Māori were protesting about they've lost their land here, they've lost their rivers here, and basically the government turned around and got sick and tired of receiving all these petitions for decades.
Yeah, and I think some of those petitions, I think some of the Kaitahu ones, in particular, just because that's what I know, started pretty much 1840, 1841, so they're not, it's not that everyone was happy for a generation or two generations and then suddenly had buyer's regret, right? There were transgressions and issues and stuff right from the start.
From all Māori, from the 19th centuries right up into the 1975, and the government basically says, right, we're going to set up a tribunal. We'll give it more powers. We'll give it more powers in the 1980s, and that can deal with all your Māori issues about your land as well as this Treaty of Waitangi. And we're going to leave it to experts to turn around and figure it out. And we're going to put this phrase in that the Waitangi Tribunal can look at all these acts, omissions that are inconsistent with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi.
Right.
And so that was a phrase put in there by the legal draftsmen. I use the term men proper because they were only men in the draftsman's office at that time.
It's probably a big problem with that.
Maybe. Who knows?
You want something done?
Yeah. But so they put that in, and they said, basically, we'll just leave it up to the tribunal to turn around and have a look at. So the tribunal, when it started to do their hearing, says, we got these principles here. principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And then it's kind of like, well, what do these principles mean? And so for a few years, they mulled around with what it meant. And then 1986, there was another piece of legislation, the state-owned enterprises, which coincided with David Longy's fourth Labour government, where they started to turn around and take all Crown assets and place them into state-owned enterprises.
So this is where all the power and the water and everything.
Neoliberalism.
Yeah, this
policies.
is like full. Yeah, it's what they call the Ruth Richardson mother of all budgets.
Oh no, that was much later.
That was later.
Yeah, that was Rogernomics.
That was Rogernomics. Rogernomics. That
Rogernomics in the 1980s, and then the government started restructuring how the government worked, and one was in regard to Crown land. All this land that the Crown had basically taken a lot from Māori that they still held.
And there was a lot of leasehold land. So I'm from a farming background as well. And leasehold land was a big thing because that was all held by LINZ at the time, I think it was called. And then at some point they decided to do this big conservation review and it was like some of it, and then a whole lot of land that previously was government land, as you say, was held in leasehold for a specific amount of time, but still owned by the government. Yeah. And then they did this kind of weird ad hoc, I'm not a fan of it myself, process where they would freehold a whole lot of land and then put other land into conservation. And we from that we ended up with a lot of added conservation land into our conservation national parks. But by and large, it was again that idea that marginal land, the tops, alpine areas, which are already very well represented in our conservation national park system, became national park and conservation area, and the low-lying and flat areas, which had, less intact biodiversity, but that's because they had been pretty much thrashed in many cases. Yeah. And they were the more productive, in quotation marks, in the idea that you could turn them into vineyards. So if you look, that process is why if you go up through central Otago now, there's vineyards everywhere. And that was sort of freeholding.
Yeah, the freeholding of Crown land.
Of Crown land.
Yeah, and that Crown land they got off the Ngāi Tahu people down here.
Yeah, so it's kind of a thing to think about that because it's...
Well, because the Crown never owned all the land within New Zealand. It was the Māori people. And then you had to look at the processes of how the Crown actually got hold of those lands. And the Waitangi Tribunal, for the last almost 50 years, has detailed exactly how the Crown actually got hold of various titles of Māori land. And that's that phrase, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. But they basically the government cut and pasted that principles of the Treaty of Waitangi into the State-Owned Enterprises Act in 1986. And that was when Māori took the government to court for turning around and saying, well, we're a bit scared that you're going to actually privatise or your land holding, so-called Crown land. And by the way, we got a claim on that Crown land, so we don't want you to privatise all this land. Right. And then the tribunal finds in our favour, and then you turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, I'd love to give you land back, but I've sold it. Here's a bunch of money instead. And Māori says, no, we don't want that. And it's against this idea of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. So it went up into the courts, and it went up to the Court of Appeal at the time, and those all very orthodox, old white judges, they looked at this phrase and then they went, oh my goodness, what does this mean? And I remember being at a conference in 2006 here at Otago, where two of the remaining judges, Justice Richardson and Justice Casey, had turned around and said to our audience, look, when this case came, we saw this phrase, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. We did not know what to do with that phrase. They said, because all of us didn't have anything to do with Māori people in our practice.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they turned around to their clerks and says, go down to the Wellington Library, go to the Parliamentary Library and get anything you can on the Treaty of Waitangi. And that, anything. So Mrs. Ruth Ross's article and all that, they got that, and books and all sorts. And they all read them, those 5 judges. And then then at the conference they turned around and says, we finally understood why the Māori people were so angry about their lands. Because they never dealt with it previously. And then they were at a crossroads. We have to interpret this term principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, they came up with what they thought that phrase meant, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Basically, they made it up.
Wow.
They said, we believe this phrase means this. We believe that the government has the right to govern. We believe that sovereignty was swapped by Māori for this tino rangatiratanga, which is the Māori version of sovereignty. And so they said all these lovely flowery things, but there's 2 main principles that they said. They said, we believe that this idea, principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, means that the Crown must act in good faith, and that must act reasonably and in good faith. And that's where the idea of consultation comes from.
Right.
And they turned around and said, the Crown doesn't need to consult, but it would be very difficult for the Crown to say they've acted reasonably and in good faith if they didn't consult.
Right. So that's tantamount to saying you have to consult, really.
Well, yeah, it's a typical lawyer's speak. It's a bit like talking in double tongues.
Yeah.
And all
so I'm
that
not
stuff.
going to prescribe how you consult or that you consult.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say that you definitely have to do it in good faith.
Yeah.
And you can't really do it in good faith if you haven't consulted. I mean, that makes sense, right?
Well, it's kind of like a threat. It's turning around and saying, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, but if you do, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
So it's kind
so
of
that
like
gave some
saying
teeth to the discussions there, or?
Well, there was one more principle of the Treaty of Waitangi that I want to explain, and that which is pretty big, and that's the principle of the duty of active protection, that the Crown must actively protect the Māori people. And it's kind of like they emphasize, we just don't mean that the Māori people need protection. We mean that you got to actively protect. So it's not kind of like saying, oh, they're protected by these laws. No. You must purposely put your mind towards protecting Māoris. You've got to be active. Right. And all that. It's not kind of like doing a budget version of protection. No, you got to go over there and protect proper. You go over there, meet with them, see what the Māori people think about certain things. And that's why we saw an example of this where John Tamahere and them during the lockdowns of Auckland were turning around to the government and say, let us vaccinate the Māori people up in Auckland. And the government was going, no, we've got it covered. And they went up to the court and says, look, we should be able to vaccinate the Māori people up in Auckland because that's part and parcel of actively protecting Māori people.
Right.
Because the Ministry of Health, let's face it, you don't know what you're doing. You're basically taking over for all people, let alone the Māori people. So let us actively protect. And they went into the courts and they won.
Right. Yeah. So when you're saying there they don't know what they're doing, that's in terms of interacting with Māori.
With Māori people. Yeah. Well, we all lived through the COVID lockdowns and all that, and the government was doing the best that they could, making decisions on the fly because there was no manual to turn around and say you must do that. They just turned around and did the best
they can with the evidence they had at the time.
Yeah, but John Tamahere and the Māori people up in Auckland says, well, this is not good enough. It's not actively protecting Māori, and so these principles, the Court of Appeal defined these principles, and then the government, Geoffrey Palmer, he was the Deputy Prime Minister under Long. He's still alive today. He turned around, was a Minister of Justice at the time, and he looked at these principles and scratched his head and goes, well, the courts have said this. How do we implement these things? Yeah. And And then various ones turn around and look at these principles and say, well, we believe these principles mean this, and we believe these principles mean that. So basically, this idea that the principles are not set, it's correct. It's very confusing.
Right.
So, just looking at, since we're at the election time, well, you see ACT wants to define the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. That's part of their policy, the ACT Party. Well, good luck with that, because the courts try to. And even if you turned around and said, we believe the principles mean this, well, there's still going to be arguments over it.
And it's a bit weird to sort of retrospectively decide that this is the one and final meaning, sort of unilaterally as well. I mean, unless you've got complete consensus from everyone, which I mean, when do you ever get complete consensus from anyone?
And
how do you actually redefine something later on? I mean, that's actually quite a... I mean, it sounds very simple when you just say it. We're just going to write it down and work out what the principles are. Yeah. But actually, there's
when you're starting to get into
think of how does that actually work?
Yeah, how to put it down. It's like turning around and saying we are going to agree on a fair and reasonable settlement of an employment issue. Yeah. And then you go, well, what does fair and reasonable mean? Well, we believe fair and reasonable means this and this and this. And another person will say, we believe fair and reasonable is this and this. And you get that dialogue there. But that's the particular problem in terms of even if you try to define the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi in an Act of Parliament, that still needs to go to the courts for them to put their layer on. Then you're going to get academics like myself, as well as all these other Māori academics, turning around, well, this doesn't mean this. And you'll get other politicians saying, well, all these principles, they mean something else. Yeah,
because of course there's a thing that I think a lot of people don't really think about when they're thinking about law, is that there's the law that government enacts and they write out what the law is. Yeah. But then that's just like the written version. Then you have to apply that to individual circumstances. And that, of course, comes back to the judges and the court systems, right? And, of course, there's tiers of court systems as well. So
ultimately, ultimately the judges are kind of like the referees.
Right.
They turn around and say, well, we believe this is. Yeah, but, of course, you've got the whole mechanisms of state, like the Justice Department. You've got the health department, the health ministry, you've got education, and that they got to turn around and look at these principles and say, how do we put these into practice administratively? Let alone councils turning around and want to put these things into that. But that's the second.
I was just going to say we need to move on to the third one.
The third one is that it's good to look at the Treaty of Waitangi in terms of a cultural symbol, as a cultural icon. And what do I mean by a cultural icon? Well, most people haven't read the Treaty of Waitangi. They don't know what's in this document. And as in regard to principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, well, that turns around and just gives everyone a headache.
That's quite a head scratcher, that. Yeah.
But culturally, like most Māori wouldn't have read the Treaty of Waitangi, but they got a fair idea what the Treaty of Waitangi meant. It meant that the British came in here and were supposed to basically treat the Māori people in a good way, i.e. not take their lands.
Right.
And of course, all these issues came about. And for today, you've got Māori only got 5%. Of their land holdings. They've got various problems as a people, urban problems, etc. And so they turn around and say, look at it, the Treaty of Waitangi, in a bit of a social justice type of way.
Right.
And then you've got various other Pākehā who will turn around and look at the Treaty of Waitangi, will turn around and say, well, actually that Treaty of Waitangi, that sort of legitimizes our place within New Zealand. And then some constitutional lawyers will turn around and say, well, no, not really. But that's the cultural side of the Treaty of Waitangi. Other particular people will look at the Treaty of Waitangi and look at it and say, oh, that's a troublesome document. They wouldn't have probably even read it. But they go, oh, no, everything around that treaty we don't like. And so you may get these politicians it's to the listeners to sort of work out what are these politicians turning around when they're talking about the Treaty of Waitangi. Are they talking about it in terms of a cultural symbol? So when they say, we want everyone to be equal, we don't want this Treaty of Waitangi out there, because that's a dangerous thing. Are they talking about it in terms of a cultural thing? Or are they talking about it in terms of some principles? Or are they talking about it with the texts?
Yeah,
so work out that.
It's an interesting kind of look through. Oh my goodness, we could talk about Treaty of Waitangi all day. Now we've just got 15 minutes left, and I do want to get on to co-governance.
Oh yes,
which is kind of related. Like it's sort of to me, it seems like it's the follow-on from the Treaty of Waitangi. So when I was sort of growing up, it was when we were having the first of the settlements, which Kaitahu was obviously right there at the start, and so there was all these treaty settlements.
And that's as a result of the Waitangi Tribunal saying, oh, all these bad things have happened, government, you need to settle. And the government, both National and Labour, in the consensus said, yep, we'll settle.
Yeah.
And that's where all those settlements have come from, because of the Waitangi Tribunal.
And that's like not the government giving Maori something, it's kind of returning land that was theirs in the first place, or where they couldn't, making some sort of retribution for it.
Well, it's actually a bit more complex.
Don't let's get sidetracked on that.
Yeah, it's a bit more complex than that. Basically, the Waitangi Tribunal says, here's some particular problems. Here's some options for you, the government, and both National and Labour look at the reports, and then they scratch their heads and go, oh gosh, how are we going to settle this? Because remember, a lot of these issues came about from the 19th century and the early 20th century.
They've been around for a really long time. And there's a whole, in the meantime, there's been this whole development of different things. And of course, it's not the people who are here like myself. It might not even be our ancestors. It was, white settlers. But they might not have been my direct ancestors. They might have been my direct ancestors. Who knows what those people got up to? Some of them were real rogues.
Oh, absolutely. But the modern people today, we got to handle it. We got to deal with it, and we got to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, and I think also we can't move forward until we've actually come to grips somehow with our joint past there.
Well, the thing about it is, like any other settlement, it's the best that they can do. They're not perfect, these settlements. They are designed to right some wrongs and to sort of address some grievance, and just turn around and say, well, we'll address some grievance, and here's this ongoing relationship that the Māori people are going to have with the Crown and all that stuff. And so just to return to your co-governance.
Yeah, so how does that fit in?
Well, the particular thing is that I'd like to emphasise to various people out there that it's actually right for people to actually ask, what does co-governance actually mean? It's this catchphrase that's out there. And basically, what you've got to go and have a look at is that there's government policies that have been passed that has said, rightio, we are going to set up these bodies that are going to turn around and going to be part and parcel of some with consents. So Māori are going to sit on some of these legal bodies and issue consents for water or whatever. Or we're going to set up these bodies that are going to turn around and going to manage Māori health and that. And that's kind of like a type of partnership type of understanding that's got to do with the Treaty of Waitangi.
Yeah, because I see a lot of people saying, particularly around the sort of the health board, like, why do Māori get their own health board? Why do they need their own health board? Why can't they just use the public health system by everybody else? Why are they getting special treatment? Yeah,
and they turn around and the point is this in terms of these separate systems for Māori, and they are right, they're separate systems and that. And always to ask, well, why do we have this like this and that? It's because the one model doesn't actually fit for Māori.
Right.
And that. It's kind of like turning around and saying, right, all you rural people, you can go and turn around and you can buy, you can go and get free prescriptions from Chemist Warehouse. And of course the rural people turn around and say, well, the nearest Chemist Warehouse is about 100 kilometres away.
Yeah.
And also, these one-fit models don't fit. And we know that within particular life. We turn around and know that there's mixed families now. Previously, over 30, 40 years, we always thought that the perfect model of a family was a mother and a father and these children, and the mother and father was married. Well, that's not what life is really. These days we have mixed families and some
all sorts of different family models.
and all that. And this is the reason why they are trialling these separate things for Māori. And that, so these different health boards, these different consents, and there's this catchphrase that's come about. Well, that's part and parcel of co-governance,
right?
And that
is that part of co-governance.
Well, the thing about it is, I'm actually unsure where this particular phrase has actually come from, because when you start looking at where has this phrase come from, and why is it being used? Is it being used in the terms of to scare other New Zealanders that Māori are turning around wanting to take over the government and all that stuff? And so you use this co-governance, therefore you don't get a vote, and these Māori people are going to control your consents, or they're going to get better health care and that.
I mean,
and that's actually, it's valid for people to actually ask these types of questions. How come they get these types of things? They should be asking those things, but they should be asking it with an open mind. Why is it like that? And then you'll start to find these answers. And of course the other thing too is, if it doesn't quite work out, let's say these Māori health authorities don't improve Māori health, get rid of them and try something else in the good old-fashioned Kiwi way. Yeah,
I mean, I guess what I would say in the meantime is that the system we've got now is clearly not working for Māori, because we have, like, for instance, the lifespan for Māori is much lower. Health is much, things like diabetes, heart disease, all these things. And when you're looking at statistics, you're looking at a public health model. You're looking at averages and numbers across populations. And anywhere where you've got ethnicity or rural, urban, however you break it down, whatever your variables are, where you've got numbers where this contrary to the common phrase, statistics, numbers don't lie.
Well, so facts don't lie.
Facts don't lie. They're there. And if you have a case where you have an entire people with a lower life expectancy, that's a problem. If you have worse health outcomes for a people, then that
for a section
of society, whatever that section is, then you need to address that. And the fact that it's numbers, it means it's not an individual. It's not an individual's fault or problem or whatever. It's a societal issue, and that means that the government has a duty of care, I would say, whatever that section is, to do better.
Well, the thing about it is there's a particular problem. Are you going to actually just let it keep going on? And some are very happy to just let it carry on. Well, you want to go and have a try at fixing it, you may not get it right. In fact, sometimes you may even make it worse with various governments. But the thing about it is have a try. It's just like if we turn around and say, well, these 17-year-olds to 24-year-olds, they've got certain problems, and do we want to try and fix these things? Oh, never mind, that's a bit too in the hard basket. Let the next government deal with it.
Hey, thank you so much for coming along today. We have just on 60 seconds left in this episode, and honestly, I could just sit here and listen to you talk for hours. It's been really interesting, and if you just had in this last couple of seconds to tell the general voters out there one thing, what would your advice be?
Well, it's like anything else. Whatever you hear around the place, do your own investigations. You turn around, whatever the politicians say, go and do your own research. And when you go and read things that people have said, make sure that they're experts within the fields or reasonable experts in the fields. Let's face it, every half dimwit within the world has got an opinion and they post it online and all that. Are you going to listen to those ones, or you're going to listen to someone that's got a bit more credibility and all that stuff? Just be wary and always test. Is this source that I'm listening to, is it credible? And then always ask, do these people that I'm listening to, have they got other agendas and all sorts of things like that? So those basic things. In terms of, do you turn around and get financial advice from a guy in the pub, or do you get financial advice from an accountant and someone working in financial services? Or you choose which one. I'm not going to choose for you. I hope you choose the latter.
You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.